I really, truly believe he had no sense at all of the shadow that he cast and how he changed forever the way people play guitar, the sound of the guitar building, one pickup guitars. I mean, you think if he had done nothing more than built a guitar with one pickup in it, you know, he could have played like garbage and his name would have been etched in stone, you know? You think about the guitar players who built their own guitar and played those guitars. I can only think of three: Ed, Les Paul, Brian May. They all built their own instruments, but more than that, they played them. That's extraordinary.
Welcome to Creating a Life in Music. My name is Mike Salo. I'm a guitarist and music educator from Minneapolis, Minnesota in the U.S., and I want to know how other musicians make their living, how they got there, how they sustain it, and most importantly, the insights and tips they may have for the rest of us. I interview musicians from all over the world, from various parts of the music industry, to break down the question, how do I do music full time? So join me as we discover the many different ways to create a life in music. If you're a guitar player who's ever wanted to attend music college but couldn't because it's too expensive or too far away, or maybe you're just beyond that point in your life and you're just too busy with your own family and your own career to commit to something like that, I would highly recommend going and checking out fretboardbiology.com. At only $29 a month, Fretboard Biology takes out all the guesswork, putting the right things in the right order. It's highly structured, highly organized, college-level guitar program designed by one of the top guitar educators on the planet, Joe Elliott. Joe was head of the guitar department at McNally Smith for a number of years, where he designed the entire guitar curriculum, as well as being head over at Musicians Institute in Hollywood for many, many years. He knows what you need to know. And you can get 50% off your first month when you go to fretboardbiology.com/register-salo, my last name, that's SALOW. So fretboardbiology.com/register-salo. Like, where'd your career start? Because I mean, I read up on you a little bit, and you were working with Guitar Player magazine for a while. Was that the first thing, or was there what was before that?
Well, I mean, if we really go back to the beginning, and I'll try to be brief. I started writing for a high school newspaper, the Culver City Centurion. I was like a music editor. In fact, I was like one of the first people to be able to write about outside non-school related activities, you know. And I said, hey, you know, why don't you let me go to these clubs and I could review shows and stuff, you know, and the students would dig that, you know. So I remember Mrs. Carpenter, who was the journalism teacher. She goes, yeah, go do that, you know. So I started writing reviews and stuff. You know, I'd go see live shows. I mean, some amazing shows. I was at the Whiskey, seeing shows like the Beach Boys. This is like 71. You know, the Beach Boys at the Whiskey. I mean, it was insane. You know, there's a club called the Ice House out in Pasadena, actually probably not far from where Edward lived. And I saw like Cheech and Chong, you know, before they were big, you know, they would do like their little routines, you know, getting high and sitting on the bench. And, you know, I mean, it was amazing. Steve Martin, who really started out as a musician. I mean, he's an unbelievable banjo player. You know, I saw Steve Martin and Martin Mull, you know, all these guys who later went on to do TV things, you know, and have their own shows. But, so I did that, and then I after high school, I went to UCLA for a year. I thought, you know, let me try to get my journalism chops together, and that was a nightmare of epic proportions. I hated UCLA. You know, I was taking an English class, and the teacher there was, you know, I don't know if he didn't like me or, you know, he said, man, he goes, you know, you think you're a better writer than you are, you know, and you're never going to make it as a writer. I said, okay. So I quit UCLA after a year, and I went out and started, you know, hustling around to different newspapers and magazines, you know, getting tons of rejections. You know, I mean, I got rejected from like Cream and Circus, you know, and Rolling Stone, Guitar Player. And eventually I ended up being published in those magazines. And so Guitar Player came along. I started writing Guitar Player December 73 was the first story that I did in Guitar Player. Previous to that, I'd done a couple small things. I wrote for a little local newspaper called the LA Free Press, which is a pretty hip, kind of an underground newspaper at the time, very political, but they had a little music section. So I was doing reviews and some interviews. Certainly starting to write for Guitar Player was a big step. That legitimized me. At the time, Guitar Player was like the only magazine of its sort for musicians, where you could go in there and find out, well, what kind of, amp is John Entwistle using, and what kind of guitar is Jimmy Page playing? I mean, there was no internet, right? I couldn't go on there and find out, 10 million things about these guys. I have to get an issue of Guitar Player. That was literally it. I actually had a lot of weight. Guys wanted to be interviewed, and I'd go in there as the writer from Guitar Player, and I was pretty heavy. It was pretty heavy stuff. Then I went on. I wrote for Guitar World beginning in '84. I'd always written for a lot of European and Japanese magazines, Player in Japan and Ad Lib, which were kind of the Japanese counterparts for Guitar Player, very musician oriented, and a lot of European magazines, Germany and France and Italy, Spain, some Canadian magazines. So, it just kind of grows, you springboard. It's like, well, look, I can show you this tear sheet from, this magazine, and I'd like to write for you guys, and I have these contacts, and would you like an interview with, Peter Frampton, So, it just kind of grew, snowballed. It was an amazing time to be a journalist kind of in the 70s. I mean, all these magazines were really growing at that time. You didn't have a lot of rock magazines, kind of early 70s. So, you kind of grow up with these magazines, you become a part of that community. It was pretty amazing. I mean, I was lucky to have, begun my career at that time.
Yeah. And as far as some of these people you've interviewed, how did you go about making those connections, or how did you get those connections to be able to, have that opportunity to say, hey, do you want an interview for this? I can give you guys an interview for this for your magazine. Right. Was that something from going, was it early enough where, you were going to local shows and meeting people that way, or is it through different connections? How did that come about?
It's funny. It's like it's like this vicious cycle. You can't write for a magazine until you get tear sheets, until you've done interviews. You can't do interviews unless you have an assignment for a magazine. Yeah. So really the big break for me came out of high school. This must have been late 72, early 73. I went hitchhiking around Europe with my buddy Chris. And I really hadn't done anything, no writing of any serious nature. I had written a couple live reviews for this little local softcore porn newspaper called the LA Star. And I call it softcore porn because you would buy it and you turn to the back of it to find the massage ads. It was back in the day when, massage was a pseudonym for, you go in there and, but they had like a little music section, like one page, and no one was going to buy the LA Star to read the music section. But, I wrote a couple of reviews. I remember one of the reviews was a live review of T-Rex, and the other one was West Bruce and Lang at the Hollywood Palladium. And this music editor, Mark Yandel, printed both of those stories. And so I think I reached out to him. I said, hey, man, I'd love to do more and this and that. And listen, I'm going to Europe, and he goes, well, listen, I have a bunch of contacts, names and addresses and phone numbers I can give you. And maybe you could be like our correspondent in, the UK for a month while you're there, and send back stories. And I go, my God, that would be unbelievable. How he ever got these contacts, I will not know. I mean, he had the contact for Tony Brainsby. Tony Brainsby was a publicist who was handling Paul McCartney Wings had just begun. This is 73. So the Beatles had just broken up in 72. So he was handling McCartney. He was handling Queen before their first album came out. Max Clifford, who handled Joe Cocker. I mean, he had these unbelievable people, and I was nobody. So I was calling up, hi, Mr. Brainsby, and my name is Steve Rosen, and I got your name from Mark Yandell, and I'm over here, and I was wondering if I could review some of your artists, thinking, what's the guy going to say? Oh, well, thank you for calling, but, Tony Brainsby said, yeah, man, come on in. We'll set you up with some interviews. I had an offer to interview Queen. All 4 Queen guys would have literally been one of the first interviews they ever did. This is like a test pressing. It's called a white label, where the actual sleeve is white, the label on the album, on the vinyl is white, because the artwork hadn't even been finalized. And literally, I would have done one of the first interviews, and I thought, well, Queen, that's probably like a glam thing, and I'm not into the glam thing. No, Tony, I'll pass on them.
Oh.
I think about that moment now. It's like, it makes me sick to think about it. But he said, well, listen, Wings is playing up in Birmingham. I'm in London. Do you want to go to like a press conference and see the show? Afterwards, there's going to be a bunch of journalists gathered together to interview Paul McCartney. I'm thinking like, no, I don't want to go interview Paul McCartney. What am I supposed to say? So I went up there with my buddy. We took a train up to Birmingham and saw Wings, and they were unbelievable. And then afterwards, we went backstage, and there's Paul, and there's Linda, and Henry McCullough, who was one of the guitar players. And I'm in this room full of all these heavy English writers, from like the Melody Maker and Sound and NME, which are like these big, weekly publications. I mean, that I just drilled over. I mean, these were like gods to me, these guys, And so I'm sitting there, with my little, $3 microphone in front of Paul's face. And I think I asked him one question, it's like, what do you ask Paul McCartney? So I asked him the dumbest question you could think of. Oh, the Beatles got to get together, And he was so cool about it. He goes, well, I don't know, but, so I can at least say I was in a room with Paul McCartney. So, so that was a big step. So I'm sending these reviews back. Mark Yandell is printing them all. And then somehow I made a connection with a company called Gibson and Stromberg. They were literally the first rock and roll publicity company. Now you have tons of them. Back in 73 and 74, man, rock and roll publicity was a pretty virgin, enterprise. There weren't that many companies doing publicity for these bands. Somehow I met one of the girls who worked there, Lydia Woltag, and she took me under her wing, and she opened all of these doors for me. She actually opened the doors for me at Guitar Player. I was in the room with her at the office. She called up Jim Crockett, the editor, whose name I knew because I had seen his name in the masthead, And I'm in the room with her, and she calls up Jim Crockett. Hi, Jim, this is Lydia Woltag, and I've got Steve Rosen here, and he's a new up-and-coming writer, and he's going to be interviewing Jeff Beck. Gibson Stromberg did publicity for Jeff Beck, and I was wondering, if you would like a story from him. And I can't hear what he's saying, but she said to me, goes, yeah, Jim, Jim would love his story. If you send it in and they like the story, they'll print it, And I'm like, oh my God, this is like unbelievable. I mean, for me to even think about writing for a Guitar Player, I mean, that's like, dude, that's like being a ball player and being called up by the Dodgers. You know what I mean? That's like, you couldn't ask for anything more. So I wrote that. I interviewed Jeff Beck. I sent Jim Crockett the story. He writes back a letter, and I still have that letter, a handwritten letter. The story is perfect. Here's $100, and it'll be the cover of the December 73 issue. And that was like, that was unbelievable. So those were key people. Lydia Woltag, Gibson Stromberg opening the door to Guitar Player. Guitar Player ultimately opened the door for Cream and Circus. In 74, I wrote my first little story for Rolling Stone on Bad Company. Man, so it was just a different vibe back then, It was like the magazines and the publicists and the writers. I mean, it was a real community, and I hate to toss that word out, but it really was, one person was helping the other. Publicists wanted stories on their artists, magazines wanted stories, and writers wanted to be published and, make the connection. So it was really this real kind of symbiotic thing that was going on. It would change, the internet changed a lot. Everything became a lot more isolated. You rarely talk to anybody on the telephone, with the internet and stuff. So it changed a lot, and maybe I'll look back and romanticize it, but it was a pretty special time, so.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds great.
Yeah.
I know, everything's a little more, and then not being from and being, growing up in that era, but I know now everything feels very, what would you say, independent, like everyone's independently doing their own little thing, which makes it for a lot of competition, but that's the wrong word I'm looking for. More of just, there's just so many people doing the same thing, and now everyone can showcase it online. So it's a lot online these days. So I got to ask, did you ever get the chance then to interview Queen?
Yeah, it's a good question, man. I interviewed Brian May twice, and I told him that story. Hey, man, I was there in Tony Brainsby's office, and I could have interviewed all four of you guys, and I passed because I thought, the name was too funny. He thought it was a riot. Yeah, I did interview Brian twice. Unfortunately, never interviewed any of the other guys. Yeah, and then when I heard that first record, I thought, oh my God. Yeah, I realized how unbelievable these guys were, and what an idiot I was, because I was like this purist guy. I mean, I was, it was, for me, it was Jeff Beck, and coming out of the, the late '60s, the Who and Zeppelin and Hendrix and Procol Harum and Free. That's the kind of stuff I was listening to. So I wasn't really a glam guy, honestly. I mean, Bowie, I later came to appreciate. I was never a huge Bowie fan. And just by the name, I thought, oh, it's going to be like that glam thing. And that whole ilk just never, got to me. But I stupidly, had this elitist attitude, and I made some stupid decisions subsequent to that. Bonnie Raitt, who was on, Warner Brothers. I mean, she literally had a lot of records out before she hit it, at least 4 or 5 records, maybe more. And I remember, man, Warner Brothers would call me, goes, hey, we got Bonnie in town. You want to interview Bonnie Raitt? I go, oh, Bonnie Raitt. Now she's like she does like this bluesy. I didn't get it. I didn't realize what a pure artist she was, and what an amazing singer and a writer and a slide player. Oh, I could kill myself for that one. And another one, and then we'll go on to the next subject here, but was the Grateful Dead. I mean, they couldn't give the Grateful Dead away, and they were also on Warner's. Now, I was never a Grateful Dead fan. Never. But it's like, why I wouldn't have taken just a half hour to sit and interview Jerry Garcia. I mean, I cringe when I think about that.
Do you think that's with age too?
Later, those are like, they're valuable interviews. And certainly, Jerry has passed away, and, I made some stupid decisions. I try not to make too many of them, but they certainly happened,
Do you think that's an age thing? Because I feel like, when you're like early 20s, there's a certain type of personality I think a lot of us have had, where like, man, you don't realize the big picture of things until like 10 years later. You're like, and then you start to open up to a lot of more things as you get older. You think that's part of what it was?
Yeah, man, that's a great insight. It absolutely was, because I started writing when I was I guess about 23, and yeah, man, for me, if you weren't born within the sound of Big Ben, and London, and the Marquee Club, and you weren't, Paul Kossoff or, Mick Taylor, or, somebody English in one of those records I loved. Yeah, man. Yeah, it was like pulling teeth to go and talk to these people. I mean, even some bigger artists, I mean, like I interviewed John McLaughlin. Now,
Ooh.
I admired and I recognized what he did, but it's like even like Mahavishnu. I mean, it's like that's a little tough for me to listen to those first Mahavishnu records. And thinking about it just a short time later, it's like, oh my God, this is like, he was a creator of all that stuff and a huge influence on Jeff Beck, who was my favorite guitar player when Jeff went out and did his first instrumental, Blow by Blow. So man, it was that ageism thing. It's like, why am I going to listen to, John McLaughlin or, oh God, there was so many other bands, and a lot of them I did end up interviewing, and I'm happy I did. But at the time, it's like, I could go either way, but I'm glad I did.
Yeah, it's funny that time frame. I think for a lot of people, especially maybe musicians as like get it the most, and artists, is there's something about I don't think like between like 14 and like 24 where we're just very opinionated on what we like, and it takes a bit to break. Some people break out of that earlier and some people never deal with it, but I have so many stories of just like the same thing of like, I don't want to go do that. I don't want to go see that person. I don't want to really meet them. It's not a big deal. I don't like, and now it's like, I know. You just, and I try to tell that to my students all the time. Because I teach some high school students, and it's like, don't be so close-minded. If you can do anything earlier, the earlier the better. You can be open-minded about music, the better. Like you don't need to keep that, because I can't tell you how many things most people have. A lot of people have stories like that where they've made some decision around, I don't really like that much, and then later they're like, I wish I just would have taken that at the time. And looking back, there's a friend of my dad's was in Nashville for many years, and he auditioned for 2 bands, and he turned down the one and took the other. The one he turned down was Shania Twain, and he took this other guy who didn't end up. He ended up fizzling out. And this was in like the 80s or early 90s or something, whenever Shania Twain was up and coming. And for whatever reason, he was like, nah, I'm gonna go with this guy. Turned down the Shania Twain.
Oh man. That's unbelievable.
If you're a guitar player or bass player, you should really have a copy of Guitar Pro tablature software. I've been using Guitar Pro for like 15 years, and I really can't live without it. At this point, it's sort of an industry standard within the guitar education realm, and it's really easy to use. You can make all your licks and write out all your songs, and you can actually use it in conjunction with ultimateguitar.com, where you can download Guitar Pro files and learn all your favorite songs. So I couldn't recommend this software enough. And if you use the code MikeGP at checkout, you can get 10% off your copy of Guitar Pro 8. That's Mike, MikeGP at checkout, guitar-pro.com.
I'm sorry, Mark, are you a guitar teacher?
Yep. So I gig a bunch in town, and I teach online, and I teach it. That's how I know Joe. So me and Joe taught at a college in town called McNally Smith College of Music. It was kind of like a Berkeley, kind of like MI. So we taught there for, he moved here about like 13 years ago to start teaching there, and I taught there for about 5. It was a for-profit school. So as for-profit schools go, they run into issues and ended up having bad management. And one day, just like the money went dry because they were running it horribly. It was an amazing school. It was really great. It was just like Berkeley or MI. I mean, they had crazy facility. It was just run poorly. But yeah, so that's what I've done for most of my career. And then I gig a whole lot in town. There's a pretty good gigging, circuit in town, and a lot of great musicians. So it's a kind of a weird spot in Minneapolis, but there's plenty of work. So yeah, that's what I do.
So you do like, so you're the hired gun to go do a gig with a band playing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I play with a couple groups regularly, and then I do some hired gun stuff, and I play in I don't want to call it a group. It's like a company in town called Blue Water Kings, and they get hired for like corporate events and weddings and like high paying stuff. And there's just a massive roster of people, and they just throw people on the gigs. And luckily most of the bands singers play the same tunes. So there's usually like 5 to 10 new songs I got to chart out like the week of. But most of the time it's just like, oh yeah, that song. Okay. Yeah. And it's a lot of fun. It's really fun. There's a lot of heavy hitters in town that play in it. And so it's just always great musicians, which is a really fun time. But,
that's fantastic.
Yeah, man.
That's cool. I mean, you know, I asked those questions. I mean, from day one, I mean, I wanted to be a guitar player in a band. I wanted to be a songwriter, you know, and, you know, it's funny because I always thought I was a better guitar player than I was a journalist, but I could never figure out, you know, how to open any doors as a guitar player. Certainly, I never could figure out how to make any money. You know, I mean, I had a couple of bands back in the day, and I was writing this stuff. You know, I was always looking for like a songwriting partner. I mean, I didn't sing. I thought, you know, I need some great singer to come along, and I just could never find that person, you know. I mean, looking back on it, I mean, at my best, I was probably a good guitar player. I was never a great guitar player, you know. But yeah, I would have, God, that's what I wanted to do more than anything, you know, play guitar.
It's,
you know, so I mean, I'm every day, or, you know, I mean, I'm going out there and I'm sitting in a room with, you know, Jeff Beck or Peter Frampton or Paul Kossoff or Gary Moore, or, you know, just looking at the pictures on the wall, you know, Mick Ronson, or, you know, Les Paul or Martin Barr or Richie Blackmore. I mean, look, I was never, ever going to be anywhere near those guys. But, you know, it's like, you know, at a point in time, like in the 80s and stuff, there was like some local bands. And because of my reputation, you know, kind of from Guitar Player Magazine, Guitar World, I was like, oh, we want to get interviewed by Steve Rosen. You know, it was kind of cool. So I had like a little bit of a juice going into there, you know. And I remember talking to some of these guys, and then I would have traded it all to have been in, you know, one of these, you know, a band that, you know, made a record, no huge success. But I guess at the end of the day, as much as I thought I worked at it and sacrificed, I wasn't really willing. Like, I have some friends, you know, my buddy Jimmy Waldo was in a band called Alcatraz.
Oh yeah, I know the band. Yeah.
Steve Vai, and then he was in a band New England. Had a couple of singles. I mean, Jimmy was driving 150 miles like twice a week to rehearse, you know, and he gave everything up to be a keyboard player in a rock and roll band, you know. And I don't know if I was ever willing or able to do that, you know. I don't know if I was willing to starve and you know, and I think ultimately, you know, you have to give everything of yourself to be able to do that. Unless you're one of these people who have this just amazing gift and, you know, you can tap into that and, you know, play 2 hours a day, but I don't think so. Not now when you're talking about guys, and I'm sure that you're an unbelievable player. You know, it's just a different, man. It's just a different level of musicianship, you know. So
yeah,
you know, that's fantastic. You can do that, man.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, it's you know, it's been a busy summer. I've been gigging a lot, but I have friends that, like you said before, is like I still look at some of my friends who are touring and actually doing it on the big level, and I think I feel similar to the way you feel about these guys you've interviewed, because I'm like, oh, that would be awesome, because that's what I always wanted to do. It was actually less about growing up. It was less about guitar, and it was about being in a band on stage. I mean, there was an age where I was like, I don't care what I play, I just want to be on stage playing in a band. So like I would play bass in bands and drums in bands and guitar, and I ultimately just sold everything and kept the guitar, because I was like, well, I'm out of all the instruments, I'm best at this one. I shouldn't be wasting time practicing drums. I need to focus. Anyway, so I look at some of my buddies, and it's a similar thought where it's like, but that is such a commitment, like to be on the road all the time. And maybe there's some part of, you know, me that was like never willing to fully go that direction. But that's like my excuse for not having done it yet, I guess, for me, not saying that. So, yeah. But I think there must be some part of, you know, some part of me that, since I haven't pushed really hard, because a lot of the guys I know who do it, they really pushed to get to that point and really gave up a lot to be touring on the road and be, I mean, it's like, I just had this conversation with a student today where it's like an all day, every day, full committed thing. if you're going to be like a touring full-time musician. I mean, you have downtime from tours, but depending on the gig, you might be picking up a lot of other stuff between then. So yeah, man. Yeah, I think I was going to ask you about the Jeff Beck connection, because that's a pretty wild one. So you went to Guitar Player magazine, but you had the Jeff Beck thing not wrapped up, but hooked up before you promoted that, or was that like she hooked up the Jeff Beck thing, or how did that come about?
I mean, the idea of interviewing Jeff Beck was like an impossibility for me. Like I said, he was my favorite guitar player. I think he's the greatest guitar player who's ever lived, in my estimation. I think Edward was the most influential guitar player, and certainly probably in the top 5 greatest guitar players. But in terms of the guy who had the technique and that, I don't think anybody comes close to Jeff. Anyway, so I'm at Gibson Stromberg, and I must have asked Lydia. I said, Lydia, any way to, my God, get an interview with Jeff? And he goes, oh, well, let me see if I can hook you up with guitar player. So she makes a call. As I mentioned, Jim Crockett, the editor, says, yeah, man, we'll take a look at it. If it's good, we'll use it. So then, the next week, I forget, Jeff was in town for, it was BBA, Beck Boger Napasi. And I go and I interviewed him, and I'm, take the elevator up to his room, and I'm knocking on his door, and it's like, I'm telling you, man, I almost turned around. I thought, I cannot do this. I'm going to, I mean, it was literal. That's what it was. He opens the door, and, we shake hands, and I'm looking at him thinking, control yourself, man. Just don't go insane, and, so we sit down, we talk, and he is just unbelievable. I don't know if he sensed my nerves or what. He was just amazing. The guy is funny. He's got this wry, dry sense of humor, he was self-deprecating about his playing. This makes me cringe. So we're talking, and I literally used a $2 microphone, and it was like this cassette player. I think I got at a garage sale. It was like a $3 cassette player, and the quality was atrocious, and the cap stands were so bad that at a point in time it would start making like a groaning noise, and the microphone would pick it up. So I'm thinking, please God, don't let the groaning be too loud that it drowns him out. So we're talking, and I go through side 1 of my cassette, and I was so stupid. At least I didn't record over the cassette, but I did turn it over. It's like I was too stupid to even use a new cassette. But so just to make sure, I rewind like 30 seconds before I turn it over, just to see, what it sounds like, and there's nothing there. So I rewind a little bit more, and there's nothing there. And Jeff is sitting there watching and looking, and I'm telling you, I realized I'm looking down. It's one of those cassette players where you have to hit play and record. Well, I didn't hit record. And I'm looking at it, and he looks at it, and I don't even know what to say. I'm thinking to myself, my career is over. He's going to laugh me out of the fucking room. Excuse my language. I'll never write again. Lydia's never going to send me on another assignment. And he looked, he goes, hey, and he knew what had happened. He says, look, let's just continue from here. You can come back tomorrow and we'll fill that in. I thought, oh my God. And, it was like, I don't even know what to say. Somebody was looking down on me. I went back the next day. We filled in all the holes, all that stuff we'd missed. I had a Strat. I had a 73 all maple Strat. It was an amazing guitar. And I just brought it, because I thought he would, dig playing it, So I go the next day, go, oh, what do you got? And he's playing it, and you can hear him playing on the tape, And he goes, oh my God, this guitar is so cool. Honestly, had he made one more comment about how cool it was, I was going to give him the guitar. It's like, dude, just take my guitar. I'd be the person who gave Jeff Beck a guitar. So that began a relationship with Jeff Beck. I interviewed him again in '75 for the Blow by Blow record, and it was an amazing interview. My God, it was just incredible. I asked Jeff, I go, Jeff, you know, do you think I could write a book about you? And he goes, yeah, sure, you know. And I mean, he didn't say no. So I began interviewing, and I'd already done a bunch of interviews, all these musicians he had played with, you know, Tim Bogert and Carmine Appice from BBA, Max Middleton, who played those unbelievable keyboard parts and wrote a lot of the music on Blow by Blow. Stanley Clarke, he played on a Stanley Clarke record. Stevie Wonder played on one or two tracks from Stevie Wonder's Talking Book record. Stevie ostensibly had written Superstition for Jeff, which is on the BBA record, although Stevie also did his own version. Anyway, that was a little bit of a thing between those guys. So, I mean, I had all these amazing interviews with guys. So I started working on this book. To make a long story short, I could never get Jeff to kind of sit down again or do phone interviews. You know, I need to do more interviews with him if I was going to do a book. He would never commit. His manager said, well, you know, we don't know, this and that. So I went ahead and kept writing this book. Player Magazine, the Japanese magazine, approached me and said, hey, would you like to do a book on Jeff Beck? And I go, absolutely. I had all these interviews. So anyway, I went ahead and did the book. It came out in Japan, in Japanese only, and the book was fantastic. However, the Japanese have this weird thing. They sent me copies of the book. I opened the book, and the first thing I see are all these photos, amazing photos, but nothing to do with me. These photos of Jeff at his house. He has like this old mansion in, you know, where does he live? Surrey, or, you know, one of the English countryside, you know, pictures of Jeff with his cars, with his guitars. And I'm looking at it and going, why are these photos in my book? There was like advertisements. The Japanese do this, like these advertisements, like these weird little drawings of Jeff. I don't know what it was. And I wrote to them, I go, what is this? They go, well, we use this other stuff that this other Japanese writer did. And I thought, this is horrible. I was insulted. Turns out Jeff somehow thought that I had something to do with that. Hated me. I ran into his photographer short while after, Robert Knight. He says, Jeff Beck fucking hates you, man. He thinks you're a fucking idiot. I go, well, listen, I tried to explain that had nothing to do with me. So, you know, that was kind of, you know, where the relationship ended up. However, in '89, Jeff did the Guitar Shop album, another amazing record, and I interviewed him, and that's the first time I had seen him since the book came out, and I tried to explain, Jeff, I did not know. I am so sorry. I would never have done that, you know. And he wasn't like visibly mad, but look, man, he was upset with me. I could tell. But that interview that we did was amazing. So I could never figure out if he was so angry, why would he sit and do an interview with me at all? You know, that's when he was playing with Terry Bozzio, you know, and Terry, I don't know if Terry knew what was going on, but he could see the way that Jeff was treating me, and he kind of apologized, saying, yeah, Jeff can be a funny kind of a guy, you know. Anyway, that's my Jeff Beck story. I've been thinking about revisiting that Jeff Beck book, you know, updating it a little bit, you know, rewriting parts of it. But it was a really good book for what it was. It was the first biography ever to come out on Jeff. And, you know, a lot of those interviews were cool because they happened sort of way back in the day when the memories of these musicians about Jeff was a lot fresher. Some of those guys have subsequently passed away. So anyway, I've been thinking about, you know, maybe revisiting it and, you know, have Jeff scream at me all over again. Well, he's not here to scream at me anymore. I take that. You know, so.
Yeah, that's wild. So was the illustrations and all the added stuff that was, okay, that was the thing that bothered him?
Yeah. And somehow, and I think it was also because he never said, yeah, okay, go ahead and write the book. He never sanctioned it. Look, there was no way he was ever going to allow it to be an authorized book, but there was also no, he never said, yeah, go ahead and write the book. And these guys, at that level, look, they're surrounded by people who want to take care of them. These guys are artists and they're delicate creatures, and so they're surrounded by these people who will do anything for them. Rarely do these people say no to them, right? Mm-hmm. When the book came out, they look on it, and I'm sure Jeff felt this way. I never had the conversation with him, as somehow he didn't control that. He was never going to do a book on his own, though he did one recently. It was a limited edition that looks fantastic. But his manager, I think, ultimately said, yeah, well, Jeff might want to do a book on his own one day. Well, that book didn't happen until, we're talking 89, 90. I think the book just came out with his passing. We're talking 30 years later. But I think it's all about control. Look, I might want to write a book about myself, but I don't want you to write the book, at all.
Yeah.
And I kind of ran into that same thing with the book on Edward.
Okay.
So they want that control. They don't want you to do it, but they're probably never going to do it either. So
right.
It's again, the phrase "the best laid plans." I read a book about Jeff Beck because I thought he was the greatest. It was 150 pages of me saying, and these other musicians saying, he's the greatest guitar player ever. And I know Jeff never read the book. He probably saw those pictures and thought, this asshole, he came to my house and he printed these. I don't even know if he put the two and two together, because obviously he gave an okay to this Japanese photographer to come to his house. It's not like a Japanese photographer showed up one day at his house in wherever it is, the English countryside, and shot pictures inside of his house and with his cars and his guitars. So, Jeff takes no responsibility whatsoever. It was all on Steve Rosen, and how could you do this? And you lied to me. And sort of point in time, it's like, okay, I give up. Jeff Beck hates me. But, I always looked at it like, hey, you know what? If you're going to be hated by a guitar player, be hated by the greatest guitar player in the world. You know what I mean? It's like, don't let it be some, nobody. But Jeff Beck hates Steve Rosen.
One of the best things you can do as a musician is to protect your own hearing. I've been using these Eargasm high-fidelity earplugs for months now, and I really love them. They're nice and discreet, high quality, and they don't make any of the sound muffled. They let in the right frequencies that I need on gigs or at shows. You can get 10% off your order if you use code MSALO10 at checkout. That's my first initial M, my last name Salo, SALOW, 10 at checkout to get 10% off your order at eargasm.com. Now, you brought up Eddie. So how did that come about? So how did that relationship start? Was that a similar story of getting an interview and then growing from there?
Yeah, it did. I need to tell you the caveat. I never saw Van Halen perform or Edward play before I met him. So that was a big part of it. So June 77, I'm at the Whiskey, excuse me, to see Cheap Trick record a live record. Not the Budokan record that they would do, I think, at 78 when they blew up. So Cheap Trick was still kind of a, well, look, they were small enough to play the Whiskey, which I think holds, 200 people, famous club, but very small. So Edward I'm there to see Cheap Trick. The girl who did the booking for the Whiskey was a girl named Michelle Meyer. I mentioned earlier, I was playing in a band at the time, and she booked my band into two clubs called Madame Wong's East and Madame Wong's West. Madame Wong's East was a pretty hip club for punk bands. It was like in downtown LA. It was kind of a shabby, chic kind of a club, and without ever hearing my band play, she booked me into both her bands. So I instantly, felt a note of gratitude, man. I loved her for, supporting me like that. So I'm there and I'm downstairs with my brother, Mick, and we're waiting for Cheap Trick to come on. And she taps in and she goes, listen, there's somebody upstairs you have to meet. She knew I was writing for guitar magazines. She knew I, geeked out sometimes over, guitar players. So we walk upstairs, and in one of the dressing rooms, and a dressing room at the Whiskey was like an ashtray with graffiti. I mean, it reeked of cigarette smoke. All these bands had written over the walls, which is actually pretty cool. This carpet is like reeking of cigarettes and who knows what else, but it was a Whiskey, it was like a shrine, really, So I'm up there, and I see this guy standing in the corner, and I always try to think, did I recognize him or not recognize him? And I'm pretty positive I recognized him. So you have to remember, this is 77. Their first record would not come out until January 78. So we're 6 months away from that. There are no magazine articles, Edward Van Halen, because their record hadn't come out. Who's going to interview this, band from LA? Even though they were doing a lot of things, it was known that they had scored a record deal on Warner's, and they were like one of the first bands off the strip to like make it to that level. So all that was known about them, but no one really knew them, on a national level. I had maybe seen flyers around, I think I recognized them, is what I'm trying to say. So we walk over, and Michelle goes up to Ed and goes, Ed, this is Steve Rosen. He's a writer for guitar magazines. And Steve, this is Eddie Van Halen, Godhead. And Edward smiles. Michelle's use of the term Godhead is what she reserved for super beings. I mean, if you were Godhead, you were the greatest thing on the planet, And she didn't throw out that name loosely, So we kind of, shake hands, and he's smoking, and I was susceptible to migraines back then. Cigarette smoke was a trigger. Man, if I smelled cigarette smoke, it could trigger a migraine that was like the pain. If you've never had a migraine, count your blessings. It was horrible. I mean, it was 9 hours of agony. So he's smoking, and I'm trying not to inhale around him, And I come to realize that he would have a cigarette in his hand every moment I was with him, which is a trial in and of itself. So we start talking, and I don't know how it comes up, but I must have asked him, well, who do you like, And he said Eric Clapton, and Clapton was one of my favorites. Cream. I mean, we're just I talked before about these bands who I loved. Well, Cream was one of those bands, and Clapton. So we started talking about Clapton. And because I listened so much to Cream, I consider myself, and I used the word before, a little bit of an elitist. I knew a lot about Clapton. I knew a lot about Cream. I knew a lot about the Yardbirds. I knew a lot about John Mayall and his early work with these bands, So if I was talking to you, Mark, and you made a comment about Cream, and you said, yeah, well, Eric was playing a Telecaster with Cream, I'd go, you stupid moron. He's not playing a Telecaster with Cream. He played one with the Yardbirds, and I can't talk to you anymore. I'm being facetious. Yeah. But it's like, if you made some comment that was below my expectations of what I think you should know about someone like Eric Clapton, I was dismissive. So I almost kept waiting for Ed to make that kind of a comment so I could think, this guy doesn't know anything. But with Ed, it was even deeper. I mean, he understood Eric on a musician's level. I mean, I understood it. Not that I could play like that or my finger vibrato. I mean, you can play like that, I'm sure. Edward could play like that. I couldn't. But Edward made comments about his finger vibrato and his tone and, how we get things. I'm thinking, wow, this guy really gets Clapton. And then we started talking about Blackmore, and I knew a lot about Richie as well. And Ed said, yeah, and his vibrato bar thing and his, that's kind of that staccato thing. And Edward I knew that Ed was a big Blackmore guy, just from our conversation. As it turned out, we would have a thing about Blackmore and Ed and me. I'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, so we talk, you know, we talk for like 45 minutes, and it's just an amazing conversation. He runs out of the room, comes back, has a pen, picks up some ticket stub or something, you know, and says, "Hey man, here's my phone number, you know, call me," you know. And I go, wow, you know, I mean, I've met a lot of musicians, and I've never had a guy give me a phone number after one interview. And that was the beginning of a friendship. You know, honestly, man, I think that seed was planted there. I just walk away, you know, man, you know, sometimes you just meet people and it's just such a comfortable thing. You know, and again, I said before, I'd never heard him play. Had I heard him play and maybe realized, you know, this guy was, you know, had I recognized, you know, how amazing he was, maybe I would have been a little bit, you know, more reticent in the conversation or a little bit shy around him. Though by 77, I'd interviewed some heavy people. I'd interviewed Blackmore and John McLaughlin and Joe Walsh and, you know, the Wishbone Ash guys. So, you know, I probably wasn't easily impressed or where I'd, you know, feel so overwhelmed by it. So fast forward to later in the year, I do my first phone interview with him, and that was amazing. February, or is it January, the first Van Halen record comes out. I think it's February. I put it on, and I'm thinking when I get it in the mail, you know, the first record has the four of them on the cover. And I'm going to go, oh, there's that guy, Edward Van Halen, you know. And I think I'm pretty positive I had seen them perform at the Whiskey after our conversation, though it's hard to remember that. I saw them. But somehow I remember that he had that big hollowed out bombshell. Anyway, I get the record and I put it on, and I'm not impressed, man. It's like, yeah, he's a good guitar player, but you know, it's just like they're trying to do like Deep Purple, really fast shuffles, you know, and Deep Purple does it way better, you know. But everybody else in the world was, you know, trumpeting how amazing this guy was. So I thought, look, man, I got to be missing something. So the next day I put it on and I sat and I really listened. And I go, oh my God, you know, this really is, you know, he really is the next evolution. You know, and I think about it now, and I wrote about it. I think what it was my heroes, you know, Hendrix and Blackmore and Clapton. It's like Edward is like the second wave, you know, and what's that going to do to the guys I love? Is that, you know, are they going to become obsolete? And, you know, not that they did become that, but, you know, Edward cast a big shadow. So, yeah, you know, that first record, and then, you know, he would come over, like before the second record came out, he would come over with unmixed tracks. And I think it was just drums and guitar, no vocals for sure. There might have been bass. And he'd come over and he'd play me these tracks, and he'd take me down into his car. He had this piece of garbage car that he was so proud of that he spent like $700 on, you know, and you got ripped off, dude. But, you know, he'd play me the tracks, and then we'd go up to my house and he'd play the songs on my guitar. I had guitars around, you know, and he'd plug it in my little Twin or Ampeg B240, whatever I had. And he'd like play, you know, the stuff, you know, and the friendship just grew, you know, and it was just this unbelievable friendship. And he trusted me, man, and there was a sense of respect. And obviously I respected him, and I was in awe of him every moment I was with him. And I write about it in the book, and I try to keep the odd part of me in check when I was interviewing him or hanging out with him, and just trying to be a normal guy who was friends with Edward Van Halen. It was a difficult thing to do, but in those times when I would get crazy and he'd play something, you know, or we're talking about a record, it was a solo on Fair Warning, and I go, Ed, my God, the solo was just unbelievable. And he goes, yeah, it was good, you know. And he was annoyed that I'd kind of drifted into that thing of like the nerd fan, because he didn't need to hear that, and people often ask me, well, what did you learn about Edward Van Halen? And I hate to be so long-winded here, man. I'm just trying to
Oh, no, you're fine.
connect all these pieces. What I learned is that, one, he was a human being. Two, he had no ego. Three, on the other side of that, he knew what a very, very good guitar player he was. But he never would say, yeah, man, that solo I did on Fair Warning was unbelievable, wasn't it? Or, yeah, man, I blow everybody away. He never, ever, not once. Not only did he ever say it, but he never acted like that. Look, and I write about it, but once in a while, he'd look at a guitar player and he'd talk about a guitar player's vibrato. But even then, it was approached, whimsically. And it wasn't like, trying to put a guy down.
Yeah.
There were a couple of people that he had early on who kind of dissed him and insulted him. And he, rightly so, was hurt by that, maybe lashed out a little bit. But that's the thing that was so remarkable to me, that he had this sense of modesty. I really, truly believe he had no sense at all of the shadow that he cast and how he changed forever the way people play guitar, the sound of the guitar building, one pickup guitars. You think if he had done nothing more than built a guitar with one pickup in it, he could have played like garbage and his name would have been etched in stone. You think about the guitar players who built their own guitar and played those guitars. I can only think of three: Ed, Les Paul, and funny enough, Brian May. They all built their own instruments, but more than that, they played them. That's extraordinary. Look, you have a lot of signature guitars out there now. Those are totally valid, but those guys aren't building their own guitars. These signature guitars aren't coming from guitars that they built. They're coming from guitars that they, customized or hot rodded or, put on a new neck or refretted or put in some pickups. And that's totally legit, But talking about somebody who built a guitar, and that guitar was responsible for this guitar sound that Edward called the Brown sound. That is a rare thing. Look, man, you're around guitars all the time. Maybe you're able to take your guitars apart. I'm sure you are, man, and put new necks on and this and that. For me, for most of the world, doing those kinds of things is an impossibility. And bringing it, down to the bare bones of where you have a guitar body and a neck, and you're putting them together and putting in frets and potting your own pickups and, setting up tremolos the way he did. And nuts, to me, that's next level stuff. That's genius stuff to me.
Yeah.
So,
I think these days it's transferred into manufacturing their own guitars. Like there are certain players who have built their own brands and then had their own brands and their designs manufactured. Like Tosin Abasi is one guy that comes to mind that's done that, but it's not building it in the way you're talking about. I think he might have done that earlier on, but yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I've done a couple things like that, but now I pay someone to do it, to put in pickups and stuff.
No, I get it. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's wild. So you meet him. So it's 77. How old is he at that time? Is he?
That's a good question.
20?
He's 24.
Okay.
So at some point later on, and I forget, maybe a year later, I can't remember. We were talking, and Ed says, "Well, I'm really 2 years younger. Sorry, I'm 2 years older than everybody thinks I am." So I don't know if it was Warner Brothers' idea. It goes to his humility. It just blows me away that he would think, well, Alex and I say we're 2 years younger. as if a 24-year-old Van Halen doing what he did doesn't have the impact of a 22-year-old, and he would think like that. It's like, yeah, Da Vinci, him creating, when he was 30 instead of 20, you know what I mean? It's just so ludicrous to think like that. But he thought like that. Which goes back to, I don't think he had a sense of his own legacy. I know he didn't. Again, he knew he was an incredibly gifted guitar player, but I don't think he, sensed, how far that shadow spread, So he was young. He was just a kid when I first met him, and he was just amazing, man. He had energy. I can tell you, at least from my observations, that it was those first 2 records and the first 2 tours when he was happiest. He was a guy who'd gone from, playing backyard parties in Pasadena, big backyard parties. These guys would charge money. They were making tons of money, to booking like the Pasadena Civic Auditorium. I think it held 3,000 people and selling 3,000 tickets on their own. They had promoters, they had flyers. That was amazing. But it's still a pretty huge jump from there to getting a deal on Warner Brothers and going on the road and touring, and opening for, Montrose and Journey, and then Black Sabbath. So for him, that whole world was opening up. He was now meeting these people he considered heroes. He was a big Sabbath fan. They were doing Sabbath covers back in the Guitarist days, So he was just, my God, he was just so exuberant, and, my God, that feeling must have just been amazing. And, to just be a part of that in a little way was amazing. I remember asking him, because they did their first big show on their own away from the Montrose Journey tour, because they weren't even given a sound check. Journey was saying, you can't use lights, you can't use flash pots, because Journey knew. They were looking, they were thinking, oh my God, these guys, keep them off our stage. So they were offered a slot on the at the Day on the Green. That was a series of concerts that Bill Graham, the promoter, put on in Oakland, where he'd draw together, 6 or 7 bands all in one day. And so they were invited to play, and they go, yeah, what do we, let's go do that. So AC/DC opened. I think it was like AC/DC's first tour. Nobody really knew who they were. AC/DC, Van Halen, Pat Travers, Aerosmith, and Foreigner. So I was up there to see Foreigner for guitar player. I was going to interview Mick Jones. And so this is like the second time I've met Ed, and I don't even know if he remembered meeting me from that first meeting. His memory about things like that was really short term. It was a strange thing. I think he had so much else on his mind. Anyway, so we meet, and I'm hanging out with him, and he's saying to me, "Oh my God, we got to go on after AC/DC." He was a huge AC/DC, but he was amazing. And I remember talking to him afterwards, not at the show, but I think a few months later, the next time I would interview him, and saying, "Hey man, were you playing well during that first tour? Did you play well at that Day on the Green show?" It was such a stupid question to ask, because he was probably playing as great as he ever played, And he goes, "Yeah, man, I think I played well. It's not like I had anything to learn from any of those guitar players, And I write in the book, I'd ask him such stupid questions, because I wanted to get at the heart of what he was, and the questions would come out. It's like they were almost insulting. He never took them that way, and they were never meant in that way at all. But, it's like, what a dumb question. Was he playing well? Oh, my God. He was probably playing as great as any guitar player, in the world. But, thank goodness he didn't think, "Of course I'm playing well, you moron." So, It's funny.
So this ultimately turns into this book. So how, I mean, so there's a lot of history, I guess, to pick through to make a book like that. Oh, because was it released in what, 2020?
It was.
So that's what, 40 years of kind of memories and stuff to go back through. How do you sift through all that?
Exactly right. So 2003 is the last time I ever speak to Edward Van Halen. So some years go by, and I don't want to give the ending away, although it's probably a little bit of common knowledge. But I was very upset the way things ended. And so there was kind of a bad taste in my mouth for many years. Let me back up for one minute here. In 1985, I was going to write Edward Van Halen's authorized biography. He signed, and I signed simple little contracts. He said, yes, you're the only person that could write my authorized biography. No one else could write that. So I started working on that. The same way I started working on the Jeff Beck books, I was interviewing friends, promoters, musicians he had played with, working on that for several years. That book never happened, okay? Fast forward to 2003, the relationship ends. I was angry, for some years, and, slowly, like anything else, memory evaporates those moments in time. And, so we come up to 2020, it's been 17 years. And like you said, if I first met him in 77, yeah, man, 40 plus years later, after the first time I met him, I had some guy saying, hey man, you should write a book. And I always kind of, I always put it off. I always avoided the question, One, I thought, how am I, like you said, man, how am I possibly going to remember all those moments in time? Two, I didn't think that I was capable as a journalist, of being able to put on paper and what am I trying to explain here? And capture who he was. I wanted whatever I wrote to be as big and passionate as who he was as a guitar player. I wanted to capture in words what he did in music, is maybe a way to put it, And I thought, that's best left to someone else, maybe another writer could do that. But then I realized, look, man, no other writer had hung out with Edward like I did. No other writer had that friendship. So I had a cat at the time who passed away a couple of months ago. His name was Arpeggio. The cat would wake up at like 1 a.m, wanted to be fed. So I'd wake up and feed the cat and try to go back to sleep. The cat would never let me go back to sleep. So I would go into my computer room and I just started writing, and maybe I had the idea in my head about the book, but I just started writing. And I wrote a couple of paragraphs that ended up being like the intro to the book. And I thought, you know what, this is not bad. This is okay. Anyway, to make a long story short, I kept writing. 14 months later, I was done. The book came out in 2 months before Edward passed.
Mm.
So Edward passes in 2020. 2021. Sorry, man, it's hard for me to remember.
Yeah, I don't quite remember. I know where I was when it happened, and I'm trying to think of. I know exactly where I was when it happened. Actually, I was in my old studio, which I was only in for a very short period of time. It must have been 2020, like October.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah.
We're coming up on 3 years.
Yeah.
So I had just completed the book a couple of months earlier. Edward passes away. And I'm thinking, oh man, now what do I do? I've written the book. Do I go ahead and try to get the book put out? Do I shelved the book, and I thought, you know what, man, I thought I had written a good book. I was happy with it. I need to go out and get it out there in the world. So in answer to your question, I had cassette tapes. I had of all the interviews and a lot of moments we spent together. I had what I call the twilight tapes. Edward would call at 2 a.m. and just want to talk. And I would turn my cassette player on because he told me, you can record anything you want of me. I don't care what it is, man. You can record it, So I knew I wasn't sort of, breaking a taboo by recording that. He wanted me to do that. And so by listening to my tapes and just thinking as hard as I possibly could, looking at my interviews in magazines and trying to remember that moment, when I was up at 5150 for the first time and sitting there jamming with Edward Van Halen, and having Edward play a solo on one of my songs. And, look, man, I'll be honest, getting high with Edward Van Halen, flying on airplanes with him, going to NAMM shows. I tried as hard as I could, man, to find those memories. And it was a really hard book to write. I had written 7 books previously to that. I think the book, the longest a book ever took me was maybe 3 months. This one took 14 months. I killed myself over every word. I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted to write a really great book. And, you never know until something gets out there. You can think you're the best guitar player and songwriter in the world, man. You put that out there and there's no reaction. I mean, what's the reality? For me, perception is everything. It's a big part of it. You think you're great until, there's no response. And so, where is the reality? It's a hard thing. But the reaction has been remarkable, positive, and Van Halen fans have said, wow, man, we learned so much, and thank you for writing the book. And to me, that's just like, my God, that kind of respect is everything. So, it was hard, but I mean, the response and the feedback has been amazing. And I'm happy I wrote the book, I really am. So and I'm sorry, one last comment, Mark.
Yeah, for sure.
And I would like to think people have asked me the question, well, if Ed had still been here, what do you think he would have thought? And I thought, well, the reality would have been, so I'm sorry, man, I have to keep backtracking. I actually did try to reach out to Edward somewhere around 2017 or 2018. I had his phone number for a very long time. I remember calling him and that number went out of order. A friend of mine, excuse me, who I co-wrote a Randy Rhoads book with, had Edward's number. He got it from someone who spent some time with Edward. He had Edward's number. And I finally built up the courage to call him. And I call him, man, I'm telling you, man, I thought I was going to hyperventilate. It's like I hadn't talked to him for years. I didn't know what the response was going to be, if he was going to scream at me and yell at me and hang up, curse me out, be neutral and not show any emotion. I didn't know. So I remember, the voice came on the phone and I recognized his voice. He goes, hi, this is Edward. I go, Ed, Steve Rosen. Hi, leave a name and number. It was his message, So I leave a message. Hi, Edward, this is Steve Rosen, man. I just want to say hello and I miss you and I hope you're doing good, man. I love you. Call me. I never heard from him. I sent emails. I had the emails for his wife, who was also doing his publicity, Janie. And anyway, so I had tried to reach out prior to starting the book. So the book's done. So people ask, well, what do you think Edward would have thought? So it's 2020. The truth of it is I probably wouldn't have spoken to Edward. There probably would have been no friendship. But I would like to have thought that he would have seen, Steve wrote a book, well, I'm not talking to him, but I know he would have written an honest book. I would have hoped there would have been some kind of a positive, response from him. I would hate to think that he would have thought, oh my God, how could he write that, after I don't speak to him, I can't even imagine that. If I really thought that was the case, I probably never would have put the book out. I couldn't live with that, thinking that I'd written something that was going to, I don't know, trigger those responses. And the way, similarly enough, that Jeff Beck, for all the wrong reasons, thought, oh God, what a piece of garbage this guy is for writing that book for different reasons, but, still having this guitar player, kind of hate me. But anyway, yeah,
that's actually what I was going to ask. I was going to ask about if he had a chance to read it or if you had corresponded with him. So you answered my question.
Yeah, never did. And, I've never met Wolf. I write about Wolf in the book. And I think I'm probably the first writer Ed ever mentioned Wolf to. Obviously his family and everybody knew, but it's not like Ed was talking to the press then. Wolf would have been 11 when Ed told me about him, mentioned Wolf, that his son, is this incredible musician and stuff. But I've never met Wolf, never spoken to him. I don't know if Wolf knows about the book. I mean, I think maybe he does. I don't know what his reaction is. I doubt if he's ever read it. But and Alex, I haven't spoken to since before 2003. And I write about an incident in the book, and I don't want to give that away. But this minor little thing, he said some things about Bon Jovi. And I printed them thinking, oh, this is cool. It was honest, And Ed later told me, man, Alex freaking hates you, man. Why did you print that stuff?
Well, it comes with the territory of being a journalist, I suppose. There are things that you might say or do that come out. Can be the same thing with this type of thing, podcast, You say anything.
Yeah, I know. And, I try to be honest with my emotions, and my brother's told me, he says, be careful what you write because it's going to come back on you. I said, no. I said, an artist is never going to read what I write, right? Famously, there's a Jimmy Page incident, John Paul Jones. I won't go into it now, but that was a big one. And there's been a few, but it's like, what artist is ever going to read an interview I've written about them? They're too busy, but be careful what you say, Mark, because it's out there forever,
All right. Well, hey, man, it was really great having you on here. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do this. And
absolutely,
everyone go check out the Tone Chaser. It's tonechaserbook.com.
Yep.
Great, man.
Cool, man. You can also find it on, if you're interested, Amazon, eBay, Reverb, and Etsy. And man, just give me some guitar lessons, and I'll be as good as you. And
yeah, thanks, man. If you'd like to join my Patreon to get your questions answered by the guests, then you can go to patreon.com/Mike Salo. There are several tiers there that you can take part in, and lots of different perks like pre-recorded guitar lessons or even one-on-one guitar lessons with me. There are live masterclasses every week for certain tiers. And again, you can go to patreon.com/Mike Salo to check that out.